Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the show. It's your host, Danny Haiphong. I am here, as you can see, with two friends of the show, Carl Zah and KJ No. Gentlemen, good to have you back on the show. How are you?
Good to be back.
Good to be with you, Danny.
Great. Everyone hit the like button. We're getting started right away. That keeps the show boosted in YouTube's algorithm. But we are going to get started. Let's talk about the panic of surrender that has been overtaking the neocons as Trump's national security strategy released has been touted as a plan that essentially admits that the United States cannot fight China and Russia directly. Now, we can start with you, Carl. You know, there is a lot being made, especially in neocon outlets like the New York Times here. Superpower competition, the missing chapter in Trump's security strategy. He's shifting from discussion of long-lasting competition among the world's biggest economies and nuclear powers. Carl, what do you make of this? Is the United States retreating? Is there an admission here that in the national security strategy, the U.S. just cannot approach with war Russia and China directly?
Well, I think of it as a tactical pivot. I mean, obviously they have not given up on the goal of U.S. primacy over the world. What they did is they hit their wall. They hit their head on the wall of reality recently, and this is a result of the Ukraine fiasco as well as Trump's disastrous trade war. They did not realize China can and will retaliate, and China has this leverage called rare earth. China still dominates the rare earth supply chain, and so they cannot proceed, as planned before to start a three-front war, like some were saying. So now they have to do it strategically. I mean, they still planned for world domination. They just realized, okay, now we got to do it a little smarter. And their plan is to shore up their control over their quote-unquote neighborhood, which is the West Hemisphere. This is why they're now focusing on Venezuela, Latin America, and even Africa. They're talking about Christian genocide in Nigeria. These are all attempts to push out Chinese and Russian influence from these regions and to prepare United States for the eventual pivot back to confront Russia and China. So this is a pause. This is a strategic pause. It's not a change in the strategic direction. This is my take.
Yeah, and KJ, to you, I wanted to just pull up a quote from this article saying that this is what Trump said in his first national security strategy back in 2018. China and Russia challenge American power, influence interests, eroding American security and prosperity. They're determined to make economies less free and less fair, to grow their militaries and to control information and data, and to oppress their societies and expand their influence. KJ, why has the language changed then? Why does it seem, according to the neocons, according to these think tanks, why does it seem that the United States in this national security strategy is backing off of Russia and China? Do you agree with this? What's your assessment?
Well, I don't agree that it's backing off on Russia and China. If anything, there's much, much more specificity on how to aggress and contain China. It's surprisingly much more specificity than is usual for this document. Usually, you have to understand the national security strategy is the first in a flush of documents: the national defense strategy, nuclear posture review, national military strategy, missile defense review, etc. And all of these things create policy and appropriations. Essentially, it's a business plan for empire, or a business plan for the capitalists of the empire. And it sets forth, mission and vision and goals, and then it does a kind of assessment of resources, and then it notes, struggles and challenges and how it's going to, quote unquote, resolve them. And of course, it throws out red meat for everybody as well. It's a little bit of what they call a Christmas tree. It has the dangling ornaments that are designed to be shiny and to distract. and underneath the tree you have the gifts. And you have to understand that, if there are flowers for Russia, there is also a shotgun and a crate full of shotgun shells for the United States. So you have to be very, very careful not to be distracted by the shiny ornaments. And you have to ask, what is it really saying? It is essentially continuity of the US project for containing and contesting and eventually taking down China. In order to understand that, you have to do two things. One is you have to read for the contradictions, because it's packed full of contradiction. So even as it says that it wants to retreat and focus on the Western Hemisphere, it talks about controlling and maintaining secure and reliable supply chains and access to critical minerals. It talks about the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is code for controlling the South China Sea and the Pacific area, and to restrain China. And of course, it has a lot of language around Taiwan and quote unquote deterring against Taiwan. So all of that signals is that it's simply a cosmetic change. They put lipstick or a different lipstick on the pig, but it is still the beast, the pig of imperialism that still has an imperial agenda to take down China. And along the way, they've understood that they need to kind of resequence, not retreat, but resequence regarding Russia. And they need to consolidate more power, quote unquote, in the Western Hemisphere, so they can build out the kind of supply chains and resources that they need to re-wage kinetic war against China. So nothing has changed. Don't be deceived. It is the Wolfowitz doctrine, simply continued with a little bit of sparkly little, little decorations on the side.
Well, what's very interesting about this, Carl, is that there's a lot in it made about burden sharing. And I wanted to actually pull up at the same time that this was announced, that this came out, there was a paper put out by a European think tank. I believe this is the European version of the, I think it's the Atlantic Council. The U.S. must beware of the deepening Russia-China axis. And essentially what this argues is that what Europe is the one that's warning now the U.S. that it needs to be taking on Russia and China. And all throughout the national security strategy, Carl, there's all kinds of references made about the so-called allies needing to take up more responsibility. What do you make of this? How does this factor into what KJ was saying and the overall aim here?
Well, I think this is Trump's baby. I mean, Trump has been complaining about the so-called U.S. allies riding on the coattail of the U.S. empire, and that now they need to pay up. They're trying to, compartmentalizing and their imperial project right now. So in Europe, what they want to do is they want to shift the burden of the proxy war against Russia from United States to its European vassal states. This is what they mean when they say, they need to shoulder more burden. They want it. And on top of that, they want these U.S. client states to shove out more money to buy U.S. weapons. This is why they're pushing, for the 5% defense spending, 5% GDP defense spending for NATO countries, and they're pushing the same on Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. It's like KJ said, this is nothing new. This is just they're trying to seek more opportunity for the U.S. military industrial complex, while shying away from quote unquote responsibilities, which is direct U.S. involvement. This is outsourcing the empire. And what interesting thing is, I think they are now prioritizing. I mean, I don't think that, like I said, I don't think they gave up the goal of containing China and Russia, except right now after they realize China hold the upper hand in rare earth supply chain. This is why they're now prioritizing the supply, to shore up the U.S. economic position. This is why that clause has now moved above containing China and maintaining a free Indo-Pacific, because they realize if they can't fix the supply chain issue for the U.S. military-industrial complex, there's really nothing they can do to confront China. You can't confront China when your military depends on components and critical resources coming from China. So now they're trying to do a military-industrial complex decoupling from the Chinese supply chain. That's what they're working on. That's why they're focusing on building addressing the domestic supply chain vulnerability. So they're trying to address the rare earth supply issues before they can, finally get to the big confrontation with China. So I think this is what's going on.
Well, KJ, let's take a look inside some of this. First, there is here reestablishing conditions of stability within Europe and strategic stability with Russia as major points here of what many are saying is a shift in how the U.S. deals with Russia, essentially wanting a cessation of hostilities and maybe even normalizing ties. But you pointed out to me before the show that there's a major section here within Asia, win the economic future and prevent military confrontation, saying to thrive at home, we must successfully compete there, aka the Indo-Pacific, quote unquote, and we are. Talk about what you think this means, because there's a lot here, and there's a lot of emphasis on economics and almost an acknowledgement that the U.S. is not, in fact, as strong as it makes it itself out to be, or maybe should be. Oh, sorry, KG, you're muted.
We have
Continue.
to look at the contradictions in the document. One way I invite people to read this is that when you are doing programming, there's this thing called code, which actually makes things happen. And there's stuff called remarks, which you can put in comments. You can put in anything you want to. Remarks are supposed to explain what the code is doing, but they may or may not. But regardless of the point, code is what makes things happen. And remarks are simply ancillary, comments. And so you have to distinguish the code from the remarks. And clearly, there's a lot of stuff which is simply code. It's boilerplate stuff that they always put in. This is the gifts for on the Christmas tree. Something for everybody. But if you dial down into the code, if you dial down, and you'll see this because there are core contradictions, is that the United States it considers itself to have a defense perimeter that encompasses the Pacific. It specifically talks about defending the first island chain, controlling the first island chain. And it's very, very concrete and very specific about how it will continue to do that. And it talks about why Taiwan Island is so important strategically and geostrategically and economically. All of that is laid out. And so we have to understand that regardless of what looks like retreat or isolationism or anything like that, is simply resequencing, and it's a division of labor, and it's a strategic sequencing that they're reconsidering. That is what is going on right now. Just kind of a side comment is when they talk about maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific, again we have to remind our audience, if they're not already aware of it, is that most of the trade going through the South China Sea is either going to or from China. There is no reason for the United States to militarize the area in order to protect trade that is going to China or from China. So in itself, it is an absurd notion. But what we can understand here is that what is being put forth is a kind of offensive/defensive realist position, stripped free of the kind of liberal internationalism that characterized previous NSS. For example, the 2022, that was all about liberal internationalism and, you know, making sure the international order was not being overrun by, you know, authoritarians and maintaining democracy. That language has been stripped out, and thank goodness, because it was so hypocritical and nauseating. But instead, they're talking in a certain kind of realist, cold, hard language, and still it still has some of the kind of flowery, you know, ponies and unicorns and bread and roses for everybody, as well as, you know, clearly strong pretensions to supremacy and primacy. People think that, you know, this is a kind of retreat from primacy towards prioritization or restraining. It's not. It still has the same primacist conceits, and you can see it in the language all the way across. You know, the strongest economy, the most robust industrial base, the most advanced science and tech, unrivaled soft power, etc. It just goes on and on. So that primacist Wolfowitz mindset is still there.
Yeah. And it certainly is a rebranding. And I think that's why it's so important that you say, KJ, that you have to read it very carefully. You have to read the contradictions, because there's a lot of branding in there that would contradict exactly that. But when both are present, when the contradictions are present together, we have to determine what is actually most important. It's actually what's so incredible here. This is what I think is, Carl, something to look out for when you talk about contradictions. Predisposition to non-interventionism, where it says that America's founders laid a clear preference for non-interventionism in the affairs of other nations and made the clear basis that just as human beings possess God-given equal natural rights, all nations are entitled by the laws of nature in nature's God to a separate and equal station with respect to one another. For a country, though, whose interests are as numerous and diverse as ours, rigid adherence to non-interventionism is not possible. Yet this predisposition should set a high bar for what constitutes justified intervention. And Carl, I mean, during the Obama administration, when he first came in 2008, he said, "I'm not for dumb wars. I oppose dumb wars." And then what did we get? We got more wars. We got smart wars. So, Carl, this feels a lot like that kind of moment, a total rebrand. What say you, and what's your assessment of this?
Exactly. I mean, they're right now. I like the term KJ is using, strategic sequencing. You know, they're now saying, okay, let's focus on homeland security, borders, Western Hemisphere, which really ties up to the same thing, which is the Neo-Monroe doctrine, to shore up U.S. position in its own hemisphere. Number three is economic security, reindustrialization, supply chain. Now, the reason they put that there, this is again the recent Trump defeat in the trade war, because China holds the upper hand in the supply chain. So they want to address all the domestic U.S. vulnerability first, before they realize they need to do that before they can really confront China. So this is why China and Indo-Pacific is put on a to-do list, but on the bottom of the list, on number 4. And this is just to do imperialism, but smarter. You know, this is something what Professor John Mearsheimer has always advocated. You know, U.S. should make up with Russia to refocus on China, but they realize that to refocus on China, they have to go maybe not the direct route. They have to refocus on China by enforce U.S. domination in its own neighborhood, and places like Africa, before they can confront China head on. And another thing they're mentioning about first island chain is they want the nations of the first island chain to pay up. You know, whether it's government of Japan, Korea, or Taiwan, they want these countries to continue to plow billions of dollars to buy outdated, expensive American weapon systems. I mean, but that's basically more of the same, because a lot of this is just a grid for the U.S. military-industrial complex to stir up the tension so they can keep on recycle back the dollar surpluses from Japan, from Korea, from Taiwan back to the pockets of the U.S. arms manufacturers.
Yeah, and KJ, I want to pull up what has been said since the release of the National Security Strategy. Pete Hegseth spoke at the Reagan Foundation at the Residential Library. Here is what he said, and I think it speaks to those contradictions.
As a result, the War Department will not be distracted by democracy building, interventionism, undefined wars, regime change, climate change, woke moralizing, and feckless nation building. We will instead put our nation's practical, concrete interests first. We will deter war. We will advance our interests. We will defend our people. Peace is our goal. And in service of that objective, we will always be ready to fight and win decisively if called upon. As part of this mission, we are asking American taxpayers to fund the world's greatest military. We're asking mothers and fathers across America to trust us with their most precious resource, their sons and daughters.
So there you have it. Trust us. Where have we heard this before, KJ? It sounds very familiar. But to you, talk about your reaction to what's been said since then here.
Well, what he talks about, and it's a common theme, peace through strength, is actually it's the neo-realist. It's offensive neo-realism. It's John Mearsheimer's theory of international affairs. Essentially, the global system is anarchic. There is no Leviathan controlling it. States are the primary agents. States are self-interested, and you can never be sure of the intentions of other states. Therefore, and this is the difference between offensive and defensive realism, is that you have to maximize power. In other words, by becoming maximally powerful, becoming more powerful than all the other states, this is how you create stability. This is the notion of peace through strength. So he's simply elucidated John Mearsheimer's offensive realism. And essentially what this does is that it turns the entire planet into an armed madhouse, which is what is going on right now, especially in the Pacific. But because of this, we are facing serious contradictions inside, the domestic affairs. We are no longer able to have a standard of living that is commensurate with, the GDP of the country. But we also have to understand this is the logic of empire. The US is an empire. The carnivore is not going to become a vegetarian regardless of what it says. And it needs fresh blood. It needs to constantly expand. It needs to control the planet. And this is simply the most recent, exposition of this take. The U.S. is an empire. The national security strategy is the business plan of the empire. And Pete Hegseth is simply pointing out, we are going to keep the empire going as we see fit and as is necessary, and we cannot dial back from that. The empire is reliant on extraction from the periphery. It has to continually be extracting from the periphery, and it also has to dominate the periphery. And everything else is ancillary to that. The quote-unquote allies are simply vassals, and they are all having, this is essentially they are having their rents hiked. And the message from the slumlord is, all of you are going to have to pay more rent. And the reason for that is because we own you and we own your countries. Everybody be ready to pay up.
Carl, to you, your reaction to Hegseth, anything that KJ said.
Yeah, I mean, I think KJ has summarized pretty well. What I did notice is they're talking about, when they're talking about building focusing on the economic aspect, they're actually talking about building an economic coalition against China. So they pose that as part of building U.S. economic security. It's not just reindustrialization, supply chain. It's actually building a economic coalition of the willing against China. But this is the contradiction comes from, because Trump at the same time he's slapping tariffs left and right against these so-called partner countries. Japan in particular is under great intense pressure right now because Japan's economy depend large part on export to markets like the United States. Yet it's expected to take on the brunt of confronting China in Indo-Pacific at the same time when U.S. is putting a lot of economic pressure on Japan. So I don't know how that it's actually going to work out in the long term, because there's a lot of realist impulse in this document. But in practice, Trump administration being Trump administration often throw out very contradictory policies that actually sabotage its goals. So I'm taking a wait and see approach to see how this can actually be implemented. Like KJ pointed out, this is just code commentary. This is not even the actual the policy that's actually been put in place in the ground. So I'm always taking the wait and see approach.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, there is a definite, because as you said earlier, Carl, Ukraine. I mean, that is a defeat. The trade war with China, that is a defeat. I mean, there is real reason for the U.S. to, as an empire, to like lick its wounds and figure out other ways of doing things. But I think the most important element for me is that what is the United States empire doing to continue its overall agenda and to meet its interests, which have to be defined. And I think they are being defined. Not everyone is against this national security strategy in the neocon think tankistan and those elites who really dictate policy. Here on Fox News, I'm going to play this for you and you can comment, KJ. The war buildup to Venezuela, I think, is a good example of this. And the CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies, funded by the U.S. government, had this to say about it.
Why is this important?
Oh, sorry. Hold on one second. StreamYard. Here we go.
That's not to reject the idea that it is important, and it's certainly not a defense of Venezuela. But when we're talking about marshaling American forces, American money, potentially danger to Americans, why is it important for us to change Venezuela?
Well, I think that this cuts to the heart of President Trump's agenda in Latin America. The priorities, as I see it, are threefold. First, migration. Second, drugs. And third, China, and to a lesser extent, Russia. In Venezuela, you have all three of those issues present, and all three of those issues present in a major way. I think that's why the focus has been so intently on Maduro, the opportunities that he provides for China and Russia to project power just 600 miles from the U.S. homeland, the regime's participation in drug trafficking, which kills Americans, and the 8 million Venezuelans who have left that country because of ruinous economic policies. I think this hits on all of the issues that the president cares so much about, and why.
So, I mean, KJ, a lot of the emphasis there was on the so-called power projection of China and, to a lesser extent, Russia, in CSIS's own words. This organization is funded by the biggest weapons contractors, KJ. Talk about what matters here. How does this relate to how we should be looking at this national security strategy?
Yeah, CSIS is one of the deep state think tanks. It's, kind of the heart of the deep state. It was originally founded by Henry Kissinger. And if you went to their, their website many years ago, you would see that they would, state that their objective was to maintain U.S. supremacy. They've removed that because it's kind of embarrassing. But they are a US supremacist think tank. And of course, they're extremely hawkish. We can see here that this is the work of Marco Rubio in the national security strategy. You can see different portions that relate to different members of Trump's cabinet, but this is the Marco Rubio section. And of course, it is all about taking down Venezuela. It is all about, creating this pretext about narcotics, which of course is not true. Venezuela, is not a player in the field of narcotics. If there is one country in the Americas which is responsible for proliferation of narcotics, it is actually the United States. Going back to the Air America, Myanmar, the Golden Triangle, all of that, and Iran-Contra. The U.S. has a long history of trafficking in narcotics and using them to fund its dirty wars and to do its dirty work, and now to use it as a pretext, as it has many times before in the past, as a way of waging war against a country. This is the new WMD excuse. But the other piece that's thrown in there is about migration. And once again, let's think about migration. Why is migration a threat? Well, actually, the empire and capitalist empires in general, they have a very fluid relationship with immigration. They want migrants to come in so that they can discipline and undercut the power of labor in their domestic countries. So they let that happen. And then from time to time, they kick them out. And they use this as a kind of a valve that they open and close on various occasions in order to discipline and control the labor market. It's a very, very deliberate thing. And also at the same time, they're using immigrants as a scapegoat for the failures of capitalism. The kind of contradictions and immiseration that we're seeing all across the United States and in Europe have to do with the failures of capitalism itself. And the Trump administration wants to blame immigrants. They are the most convenient scapegoat, and literally like a scapegoat, you chase them out of the city walls and you slaughter them. That is the idea. So this is just more of the same. It's the logic of capital and the projection of the need to disown the failures of capital that are being projected onto immigrants as scapegoats. And not to mention the fact that many of the immigrants in Europe, for example, are refugees from US imperial wars. And so all of this kind of ugly, dirty, mess is simply being victim blamed back onto the people who have suffered most from capitalism. And then we're also throwing in China. Certainly they do not want Venezuela to be part of the Belt and Road, which has been salutary for all Latin American countries and certainly for most of the global South. They want to make sure that the Belt and Road does not get any traction, but certainly not in the US's backyard, which the US considers to be, its colonial territory. It will not tolerate that. And so it wants to undercut Venezuela. It also has to do with the fact of controlling fossil fuels as they relate to the petrodollar. Trump has made it very clear he wants to ensure the continuity and the strength of the dollar as the US global currency, as the US global reserve currency. And he wants to make sure that any challenges to that in terms of, alternate fossil fuel tracks and the support and the relationship between Venezuela's oil and Russia's oil and China's energy needs are severed and damaged to the greatest extent possible. So hence we see this massive escalation against Venezuela and this kind of consolidation, this kind of fortress consolidation of power inside the Western Hemisphere, despite the fact that the US still considers the entire Pacific to be its strategic defensive perimeter.
Yeah, Carl, the contradiction is absolutely out of this world when it comes to wanting to, quote unquote, stop migration and yet also wanting to very openly to conduct regime change in Venezuela, which already with the sanctions has caused a pretty big migration crisis. A war would definitely worsen that. But maybe you can talk about too the relationship with China and to an extent Russia that keeps on coming up when it comes to this war on Venezuela. It seems like the Monroe Doctrine for the Trump administration now is really a doctrine to prevent Russia and China from doing any business in Latin America in the region. Your thoughts?
Well, the first Monroe Doctrine was to reserve the Americas, the West Hemisphere, for United States. To keep the European powers out. What I did agree with KJ is there's a heavy domestic component of the U.S. foreign policy. Like this whole regime change Venezuela is Marco Rubio's baby, and Marco Rubio has always been a hardcore anti-communist, and he's an establishment neocon. He is a neocon. He's not reconstructed or reformed. He's just a traditional establishment neocon, and now he's been put in charge of U.S. foreign policy. And Marco Rubio himself also has, presidential aspiration. He ran for president before, and it's very likely he will try to run again, in 2028. In a way, he's building his portfolio right now. This is his chance to build his legacy, build his portfolio for his future presidential run. And yes, there's contradiction about wanting to stop migration, yet wage war on Venezuela, but that's all immaterial to presidential ambition of Marco Rubio. For him, the important part is to overthrow left-wing governments in Latin America. And as for Russia and China, in many ways, it's just an excuse for U.S. to go in there and carry out its aggression against Venezuela, because Chinese involvement in Venezuela is mostly economic. China is the largest importer of Venezuelan oil exports. Now, this is a case where U.S. do want to be able to monopolize oil resources of Venezuela. Venezuela being has the world's largest reserve of oil, but Venezuela produce a particular type of oil, the heavy crude oil with high sulfur content. Now, traditionally, the American refineries in the southern rim of United States, particularly around the Gulf of Mexico, they are built to take those heavy crude and process them into petrochemical products. So Venezuelan oil is perfect for that. This is why even during this heightened tension, Trump still gave a waiver to Chevron to continue to ship oil from Venezuela to refineries in southern United States to process. What U.S. what U.S. is doing currently. They after the shale quote unquote revolution, when they start fracking, they produce a lot of oil, but they produce the light sweet oil with very low sulfur content, and those are not suited for the existing refinery in southern United States. So what U.S. do is they actually export those light sweet oil, and they import Venezuelan heavy crude for process in its own refinery. So when China moves in and start to take a large chunk of Venezuelan oil export, for United States, that's viewed as, okay, you are taking this black gold from our neighborhood, from our backyard. So this is the economic argument, but largely this is really just an excuse, for this very naked resource grab in Latin America. This is not just about Venezuela. This is going to affect the whole Caribbean. Venezuela, Trinidad, all the Caribbean basin will be affected because they also share oil and gas resources in the Caribbean. So as much as Venezuela has has strong relationship with China and Russia. For the U.S. imperialists, this is just provide the perfect excuse, because another thing China is done is it's investing in Venezuela's aging oil infrastructure. But traditionally, before the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela depended on foreign oil company, particularly American big oil, to come in and to help service their oil infrastructure. Now, China, so Venezuela for a long time, they're exporting crude oil, but they have to import petrochemical products because they didn't possess their own refinery to process their own crude. So they're acting as like kind of like the like a typical third world country commodity producer. They're exporting raw commodities and receiving manufactured goods. What China is helping Venezuela to do right now is trying to build up refinery inside Venezuela, so the crude doesn't have to leave Venezuela, but to be processed into petrochemical products that Venezuelans will need. And this again, this is eating into the cake of American big oil. And big oil is one of the biggest backers of Trump. This is another reason Trump is saying, screw alternative energy. We're just going to go 100% into hydrocarbon, drill, baby, drill, because he knows who is his base. His base is big oil. That Trump's administration is throwing their lot 100% with the big oil. So this is about oil. This is about resources. This is also about keeping China and Russia out. I think it's more like a bonus, but it's more an excuse for them to carry out this aggression.
Yeah, what do you think, KJ? Because there is even prominent neocon warmongers who never really oppose war, who are very concerned about this potential, what is likely to be at least some kind of U.S. intervention, deeper war on Venezuela. What do you think what Carl said, and why is there concerns about this, despite the fact that there's alignment, as we saw with CSIS, on some of these major points?
Yeah, well, before I get to that, I agree with Carl that you can see the workings of the capitalist elites. And certainly big oil has had a strong hand in this. And the other elites that you can see had done their lobbying for this document are the tech bro elite, the tech bro carpetbaggers who want to profit from war. And they want their digital Wolfowitz doctrine. So we're talking about Eric Schmidt, Palantir, all of these AI tech bros. They want to control the internet. They want to make sure that the national security strategy reflects their intention to control the internet and the entire global information sphere for themselves. And that, again, is explicitly written into the national security strategy. So the digital Wolfowitz doctrine is clearly resurging here. But the other question that you ask regarding, why are the neocons concerned about war with Venezuela? There are different factions of the neocon elite, and some of them they're pulling in different directions. They are uncertain. I mean, what they do know is that U.S. is in serious trouble. It cannot maintain a protracted war anywhere. It certainly cannot maintain a protracted war with Russia, certainly cannot maintain a protracted war with China over Taiwan Island. Recent estimates have shown that if they went to war, they would run out of missiles in about 1 week. And they still want the United States to focus on China. They're afraid that if it gets distracted in yet another unwinnable war in Venezuela, and Venezuela is an immense country that has both mountains and jungles. The US never does well in mountain warfare or in jungle warfare, as you can tell from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and Vietnam. And so they're concerned that this is going to be yet another quagmire that the US will sink into. And they want a rapid pivot to war with China But of course, that is even more unreasonable. It just speaks to the kind of irrationality. It's one kind of irrationality versus another. But you have the neocons that are hot about a war with Russia. You have the neocons that want immediate pivot to war with China. This is the CNAS crew that are still very, very influential. And then you have others that are, concerned about their own particular interests. So competing factions inside the ruling imperial elite are starting to come to grips with the fact that the US is not capable of waging 2-front, 3-front, 4-front war with superpowers, and yet they still want it all. They're still incapable of coming fully to grips with reality. As the neocons said, Karl Rove is the purported author of this, is that we are an empire now. We create our own reality. The rest of you can just suck it up and study it. There's still neocons that subscribe to that belief.
Carl, can you comment on this notion that we've heard so many contradictions? You made the point that fear mongering about Russia and China is a lot about just justifying U.S. interventionism as exactly as you laid out earlier about the Monroe Doctrine, justifying bigger U.S. presence, a more devastating U.S. war assault on Venezuela. But then there's also those who have said that Russia and China have abandoned Venezuela, when, from my estimation, my assessment, Venezuela would have a really difficult time if it were all by itself without any economic and military partnership with China and Russia. What do you say to this in terms of these narratives that we hear, and comment on what KJ said about the difficulties of this potential war for the U.S.?
Well, first of all, China is sustaining the Venezuelan economy now, being the largest buyer of Venezuelan oil export. So people keep in mind that is a real material support, very real material support that keeping Venezuelan economy afloat. And one of the angle for U.S. plan for Venezuela has always been regime change. This is the logic of sanction. They sanction a country to trigger economic collapse, and the United States has been trying to do this to Venezuela for decades now, ever since Hugo Chavez came to power, and Chinese buying Venezuelan oil is sustaining the Venezuelan economy in the face of stringent U.S. sanction. And a lot of people are expecting China and Russia to go harder, go aggressive, to fight a World War III with the United States. That's just not realistic, right? I mean, for anything, China and Russia, they want to calm the waters. They don't want to trigger a World War III. And so I don't know. Like, I think there are too much expectations from the people who feel hopeless, especially people who live in the imperial core, who are themselves hopeless to change the foreign policy of their own countries. So they kind of project their hopes and dreams onto others like China and Russia, and then they get disappointed when China and Russia don't do what they want China and Russia to do. That's just very naive way of looking at the geopolitics. And I don't pay too much attention to those criticisms. Venezuela, they do have Russian military hardware. At this particular juncture, even if China and Russia were to rush more military equipment to Venezuela, it would not be timely enough, because then you will need to train people, personnel to be able to familiarize with weapons. Those trainings will take years. This is, both China and Russia have made very clear statement that they oppose unilateral U.S. actions, U.S. aggression toward Venezuela. And so far, it's not exactly clear that U.S. is signing on for a boots on the ground invasion. I don't think that's in the cards. I think U.S. is still playing playing up the theater of intimidation, trying to force a change domestically inside Venezuela. I call this doing regime change on the cheap. They have always tried this, by the way. They have sponsored coup. They have tried to sponsor opposition figures like Juan Guaido in the past, and now Machado. And they're trying to apply maximum pressure, hoping the Venezuelan society will crack internally. And then, they may be causing a civil war. This is like the Libyan model. So they might even go as far as launching a couple bombing runs, like what they did in Libya, to cause panic and then to support opposition to overthrow the Venezuelan government. In this case, it's China. There's limited thing that China and Russia could do. If U.S. was just doing this show of intimidation in hope of Venezuelan society to crack, it's really up to the Venezuelan government. So far the solidarity of Venezuelan people have held up. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the immediate future.
Yeah. Your thoughts, KJ, before we move on this with anything Carl said, and same question to you.
I agree with Carl. Time is on the side of the multipolar world. U.S. is facing a serious crisis of capitalism, but more than that, it has come to the understanding that industrial capacity matters. It's certainly in the case of industrial war, such as in the Ukraine-Russia war, industrial capacity matters, and especially in the matter of rare earth elements. Rare earth elements are critical for military prowess, and after China restricted rare earth elements, they understood that it does not have, or it really has difficulties reindustrializing, and it really will have difficulties building up rare earth element processing capacities. China has built this up over a 50-year period, and the US is not going to do that in 5 years, let alone 2 or 3. It has already de-skilled its workforce, and it has already deindustrialized. And its ruling elite can only think in profit maximizing short-term rentier extractive terms. And so the US is facing a serious crisis or a dilemma, and time is on the side of the global South. So the Chinese, what they want to do is they want to avoid getting into a kinetic war. They understand that it's simply a matter of continuing to do what they are doing, continuing to build out their alliances, build out the economic alliances of the global South through the Belt and Road and through BRICS. And they do not want what the US wants, which is a quick and dirty gambit that pulls them into a kinetic war that weakens both the state that they're trying to undermine, in this case Venezuela, and China itself. So I don't think that's going to happen. But what is going to happen is China is going to continue to give economic support, certainly political support. And if the US is foolish enough to get into a war with Venezuela with boots on the ground, which I agree with Carl, seems unlikely. But if they actually put boots on the ground, it is going to be Iraq and Vietnam all over again, something that ostensibly they say in this national security strategy that they don't want, but that will be like that, but certainly much, much worse, because we have seen that the US counterinsurgency strategy does not work, certainly didn't work over 2 decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now we're seeing that with the development of electronic warfare jamming capacities, which are now becoming normalized for even small wars, it is going to be a much, much harder haul than the US has had before. It will not have the kind of open capacity to bomb, poor, impoverished peasants at will. It will find that it is being resisted on multiple fronts, and that the electronic spectrum is contested in all domains. And they will find that they have a much, much harder fight than they have ever had. Certainly much harder than Afghanistan, certainly much harder than they had in Vietnam, which were both drubbings, serious losses for the U.S.
Yeah. I mean, the talk about contradictions, the idea that the U.S. would do a Vietnam or Iraq-style intervention at the same time that it releases a so-called strategy that claims to want to do the exact opposite. And I maybe Carl, I'm wrong, but I'm old enough to remember the Bush administration and then even Obama after. But the Bush administration had a really difficult time, and at the same time had a lot more effective, in my opinion, politicians, elites. Obama had very effective elites around him and himself to get through this. I'm not so confident that's where some of my cautious optimism is. Similar to Iran, I'm not so confident that the Trump administration has that level of stability and that level of legitimacy to pull something like this off. But I could be wrong. I don't know. What do you think, Carl?
Well, I mean, you have to remember Bush, that was 25 years ago. And that's like 25 years of deindustrialization years ago. I mean, it has been 2 decades. Since then, it has been 2 additional decades of deindustrialization in the United States. Right now, U.S. are losing aircrafts in South China Sea before China even fired a shot. They have some serious issues. The U.S. the whole lack of human capital, lack of investment in the domestic infrastructure is already now impacting the U.S. military-industrial complex. The Navy, they couldn't find enough people to staff their ship. They couldn't build their ships fast enough. So United States have facing serious resource constraint and very serious structural problems. So this is why I'm long-term optimistic, because the U.S. decline will continue. I mean, it is a big problem for countries like Venezuela to face right now. But I think as long as Venezuela can have its social cohesion, hold together long enough, they can wait U.S. out.
And that brings me, gentlemen, to one of the final topics I wanted to discuss today, which is this ongoing China-Japan row, because I think it reflects a lot of everything that you just laid out, Carl, and to an extent what you were talking about, KJ, throughout this program. So, as you may know, Japan has accused China of locking its radar, its J-15 radar, on Japanese aircraft. And this comes amid lots of tensions, not just between China and Japan over Takaichi's comments on Taiwan and her ongoing wishy-washiness around this that has greatly offended China, but also Donald Trump first calling Takaichi, saying cool it some weeks ago. And then now it's being said that Japan is frustrated with Donald Trump for the administration's silence over this row. Japan is asking the U.S. to be more vocal in its support after Beijing has reacted furiously to her comments about Taiwan. So, KJ, well, we start with you. What's your reaction to all of this? Because this is a row that is not going away, and it is becoming more and more tense, especially on the military front, and especially the diplomatic fronts. What's your take?
Well, I think the most important thing to understand is Japan is a U.S. proxy. The Liberal Democratic Party of Japan exists only by virtue of being constructed by the United States. It was put together from the unrepentant militarists, the military industrialists, and organized crime. It was put together by the CIA, and they have held one-party control over Japanese politics for almost since the 1950s, except for an eight-month period, which was minor aberrations. They are one-party rule. They were put into power by the United States. They do the bidding of the United States. And Takaichi is the most extreme far-right fascist faction of the LDP. This is the Nippon Kaigi Seiwa faction that wants to remilitarize and reinstitute the Japanese monarchy, essentially the Japanese imperium, and to dominate Asia as they did prior to World War II. So inside that context, Japan is functioning as a U.S. subcontractor, an imperial subcontractor, a proxy for the United States. If it says anything, if it does anything, it is saying out loud what the United States is thinking. And so there has been this kind of overt row that has been brewing. China has sent very, very strong messages to Japan telling them to knock it off, and that if it has aggressive designs against China, which that statement that it would see a Taiwan contingency as a Japan contingency, that it would see that as a survival threatening situation. This is coded language. This is what Japan has always used when it goes to war, certainly against China. It used the same language, survival threatening situation, in 1894 when it took Taiwan. It used the same language in 1931 when it invaded northern China. It used the same language in 1937, used the same language in 1941. This is the language that it uses when it goes to war. And Shinzo Abe, who was the mentor to Sanae Takaichi, wrote into the Japanese legislature the 2015 law that says that survival threatening situation authorizes aggressive war. That is to say, he completely gutted Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which Japan is only supposed to engage in self-defense. This is the clause that allows expeditionary war. And Sanae Takaichi has connected that clause with war against China over Taiwan, which is China's sovereign territory. China doing sovereign things inside its sovereign territory is not a cause for Japan to get involved or to call it a survival threatening situation, which is what Takaichi did. And so China now is escalating, sending strong messages to Japan. Don't get involved in our internal affairs. Don't get involved in war of aggression against us, because the last time that happened, you got away with killing off 35 million Chinese. This time, it's not going to be so easy. So strong signals are being sent to China. And of course, Japan wants the United States to back it up, because this was a little bit of a gaffe. I don't think they wanted to show their cards so soon. But at the same time, the United States is facing a contradiction right now. The contradiction is that it absolutely needs Chinese supply chains. It absolutely needs Chinese rare earth elements in order to wage war against China. The Chinese are wise to this, but they don't want a near-death experience like they had, a few weeks ago with, for example, with Nexperia. And these supply chains, as I said, are irreplaceable, at least over the next few decades. And so the US doesn't want the dependency. It wants to decouple. It wants to nearshore, friendshore, reshore all these critical supply chains. But it can't do that yet. These are impossible tasks. The machinery and patents for rare earth elements are all Chinese. The US cannot reindustrialize to the degree necessary. And the US allies are also dependent on China for their own supply chain. So any friendshoring is actually the Chinese supply chain, which is being disguised as allies' work. So these contradictions are irresolvable. The US needs to make nice with China until it can resolve this irresolvable contradiction. And in the meantime, Sanae Takaichi has gotten too high on her high horse and kind of, let the cat out of the bag. And the US is not backing up Japan, even though it has plans to use Japan as its agent for war. That's why the US is preparing a joint command between Japan and the United States, just as it has a joint command between US and Korea. It wants Japan as a proxy. It wants empire on the cheap. It wants Japan to do its dirty work, but it's also slapping it down because it got a little bit too forward. And that is the Japanese militarist, imperialist, Nippon Kaigi faction speaking out of turn. It is supposed to be serving the table. It does not have a place on the table. And when it does, it gets slapped down.
Yeah, Takaichi is something else. I know you saw Carl, I'm sure, going around social media when she was speaking, I think, to Gulf investors and quoting anime, literally quoting anime, say Attack on Titan, which actually has heavy fascist references, honestly. Shut up and invest everything in me. But China is not happy. It doesn't even matter that Takaichi has said that she reaffirms the stance. In fact, China rejected this, and their foreign ministry spokesperson wants her to articulate what actually is stated in the 1972 Sino-Japanese joint statement. So, Carl, you are a history buff. How did it get here, and why is this getting so tense so quickly?
Well, first of all, it's totally unnecessary. Takaichi decided to poke the hornet's nest. She wanted to poke the bear, and I think Japan has, as KJ has pointed out, has been a U.S. client state. A frontier post in Western Pacific, but in a way, not dissimilar from the roles of countries in EU. They perform a similar role. Yet, when U.S. want to, at this point, U.S. interest is to offsource more of this imperial project to its vassals in Japan and EU. But at the same time, it wants to fix other issues like he considered more important, like lay out in the national security document, that he wants to fix its supply chain vulnerability vis-a-vis China. He wants to shore up its position in West Hemisphere, vis-a-vis Venezuela. So it has, from perspective of Japan and Europe, they see this as a pivoting away from their theater. And they are the ones that are going to left with holding the bag of confronting the big Russian bear or the angry Chinese dragon. So Takaichi, in essence, is doing this to intentionally stir up the hornet's nest, as a cry for help, to drag the United States back in. It's like, no, you cannot deprioritize us. You cannot deprioritize the Japan-U.S. security agreement. You got to be here to back us up versus China. But even though U.S. hasn't given up on the goal of containing China, it needs Japan to do that. As KJ pointed out, it didn't need Japan to be so forward at this particular juncture when U.S. is trying to, prioritizing other things of its imperial project. This is why Donald Trump reportedly called Takaichi and tell her to cool it, and this is why Japan is angry they're not getting the backing they were hoping for from the United States. Now, Takaichi did this also to shore up his own domestic standing in Japan, because he knows this will evoke intense criticism from China by stepping on China's reddest red line, and that could ricochet back to Japan to spark even upsurge of the Japanese nationalism, which then will boost his domestic standing as a politician who can be tough on China. We actually saw her popularity soar temporarily in Japan. This was part of the playbook because Japan is facing serious economic headwind right now. The Japanese economy is quietly imploding. The bond interest rate has gone up. For decades, the Japanese central bank has printed tons of money to do the cash infusion to keep the Japanese economy float. But now, finally, the investors are rebelling. They're like, okay, if you continue to expect us to buy Japanese government debt, we need expect some return. So this is why the Japanese bond interest rate has been going up. This is going to have a huge ripple effect across Japan, but also going to spill over into the U.S. Asset market, because a lot of the Wall Street types have for decades been borrowing tons of Japanese yen to invest in higher yield asset in American stock market and bond market. And the unwinding of the yen carry trade is going to have serious whiplash effect. So Takaichi is facing, she is not fixing the flagging economy is hard. It's much easier to do grandstanding. This is the problem with a lot of the politicians in the so-called developed world. Rather than doing the hard work of fixing structural problems that can allow your economy to grow again, let's redirect the public attention. Let's stir up tension that will shore up our own public standing. We can do that as simple as making a provocative statement, and for decades that has worked because China, they did not expect China to retaliate. They thought they could get this popularity boost for free, but China in 2025 is not China of yesterday. Now China do have a lot of cards on the table. China could already, their immediate hit of Japanese economic sector is the tourism. Chinese tourists make up the largest group of tourists that come to Japan, and tourism is 7% of the Japanese economy. That took an immediate hit. And this is even before China to activate its grip on the rare earth supply chain yet. If China cuts off the rare earth supply chain to Japan, that will ground all the advanced manufacturing in Japan to a ground steel. Those are the things that China, if China chooses to, could exercise. This is why the Japanese government is now trying to backpedal. But still, they're using language that kind of, by saying, oh, Japan, because of the San Francisco Treaty, Japan is not in a position to decide on the status of Taiwan, which is completely bogus because, the San Francisco Treaty was structured by the United States to explicitly exclude both governments of China, both the communist government and the KMT government, and also Korea. So Korea and China were excluded from the Treaty of San Francisco to settle World War II, and this had, whereas when Japan and China formally established normalized their tie in 1972, they both sides agree on the one China principle, which is that Taiwan is a part of China, and the only legitimate representative of all of China is the government in Beijing. This is the same principle that's underlying the Sino-American relationship, which the U.S. administration have been sabotaging in more recent years. But now, Takaichi made it more explicit by peeling away the strategic ambiguity on the question of Taiwan by saying that Japan will militarily involve. I think she will have to eat some crow, because China is going to make sure they will have to suffer some consequences for this reckless action. From China's perspective, this is a wholly internal Chinese matter. Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan issue is to be resolved by Chinese people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. For Japan, a former colonial power who was deeply involved in carving Taiwan away from China to saying they're going to send military to Taiwan. This is totally unacceptable. This is why this role has deepened. Japan did this hoping U.S. will come to their to reaffirm their backing of Japan and to drag U.S. back to the to the front line in the Western Pacific. But so far they have failed. And because ultimately Japan is kind of stuck strategically, like EU, they have depending on US for security for so long, and they got very comfortable, and they profited from the post-war order by acting as deputy of United States in their neighborhood. And now with the US decline, they have not fully made the adjustment. Japan at some point need to make we'll have to come to terms with the fact that they're in fact a East Asian nation, and to make peace with its neighbors, Korea and Japan, and rather to acting as the proxy of U.S. to keep the two other countries down.
Yeah, maybe stop drinking that long shui, that cold water. That would go a long way in embracing their the fact that they're an East Asian nation. KJ, and both of you final comments on this. There's been, Carl, you pointed out a lot of Zionist entity Israeli outlets on X talking about how Japan is going to respond to China's transgressions with its military targeting of things like the Three Gorges Dam, and it's going to be an absolute disaster. I'm curious if you could comment on this, because obviously Japan, with 100 or some U.S. military installations, as well as a renewed commitment to militarism, is obviously an important cog to this renewed and escalating Cold War on China. But KJ, what's your reaction to this, and anything else you want to add to it?
Yeah. First, I'll talk about Sanae Takaichi a little bit more. Sanae Takaichi poses a problem for the United States that all U.S. puppets pose. The U.S. installs these puppets, and it wants people who are stupid enough to follow U.S. dictates, but are smart enough to tactically produce the results that they want. Clearly, she is falling on the stupid end, like Kaja Kallas or Liz Truss. And so she's clearly shown herself to be incredibly foolish, incredibly, way out of her league. And also, you want people who are malleable, but if they're too malleable, they're not aggressive enough. And if they're too aggressive, then sometimes they become a loose cannon. So she falls into that loose cannon category. We've seen this throughout history with American puppets. Syngman Rhee, was a loose cannon. Zelensky is in that loose cannon category. Yoon Suk-yeol was a loose cannon. And so Takaichi is also bordering into that loose cannon category. And so the question becomes, is she going to last, or how long is she going to last? And this is always the problem when you have quislings and proxies and puppets. The US always has this problem, and it has to figure out what to do with her. Is it going to cut her loose? Is it going to take her down? Is she going to be replaced, or are they going to be able to reform her? So we'll see what happens. But my intuition is that she is not for long as the Prime Minister of Japan. I don't think she is going to last long. Certainly she's outlasted Liz Truss, but I think she is still on that same trajectory. Now, regarding Japan and is Japan going to respond? Well, once again, we have to highlight the fact that Japan is a U.S. base, as they call it, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It hosts probably 55,000 troops. There's some of the most powerful force projection platforms in Asia. It has about 70% of its bases on Okinawa, which is about 2% of the territory, but it hosts 70% of U.S. bases. And the U.S., does atrocious things. Essentially, they run it as their own colony. And of course, there's this continual creep where they're militarizing Okinawa and the island chain closer and closer to Taiwan Island, placing very, very aggressive missiles and missile, defense systems on that island, Yonaguni, for example, and Iwakuni, and all the other islands in that chain, closer and closer to China, which signals that they are thinking more and more aggressively about kinetic war. The staging is already happening. And so, it's understandable that, there are people on the left or on the right or on the fake left that are very, very excited that Japan is finally going to take some kind of kinetic measure against China. I don't think it's going to happen yet for the reasons that I've described earlier. Of course, the U.S. wants the burden shifting. It wants the division labor. It wants the cost imposition. It wants Europe to spend 5% of GDP on military, and it wants Japan to move up to 2, and then 3, and then 4 and 5. And it wants all these forced alliances to do the bidding of the United States as proxies. In other words, the U.S. wants empire with all the fixings on the cheap. So that is clearly the larger agenda, but it doesn't want to do it just yet because, as I pointed out, the U.S. is in the process of building out a joint command with Japan, just as it has a joint command with South Korea. Joint command between the United States and another country means U.S. command. Essentially, just as the U.S. has OPCON over South Korean troops, it wants OPCON over Japanese troops. And that process is happening right now, but it's not complete yet. So they don't want Takaichi, and they don't want the Japanese to get too big for their britches and to shoot, to go off before the starting gun goes off. So they're going to pull this back a little bit. They still need to do more preparation. They still need to do more coordination. And they need to get Lee Jae-myung, the president of South Korea, back online. Yoon Suk-yeol was the perfect U.S. sycophant. He was doing everything that U.S. wanted. Yoon Suk-yeol is more of a maverick. He is his own man. He wants to wrest back operational control from the United States. He wants Korean troops back under Korean control and out of U.S. control. And so he's working hard for that. And so the Japan-U.S.-Korea alliance, JACUS, is facing stresses. And without that tight coordination between Japan, Korea, and the United States, any Pacific campaign is not going to be successful. So they want to keep Japan from shooting, it's shooting off prematurely, and they want to make sure that everything is properly controlled. And this is why they need to, rein Takaichi back in and have a more, measured and systemic escalation rather than, prematurely going off. That's the issue that they're facing right now.
Yeah, Carl, to you, your reactions and thoughts.
I just want to mention that I noticed there's a lot of Zionists, hardcore Zionists, posting really insane tweets to stir up hatred against the Chinese people and China. It's very obvious what they're trying to do. They're trying to distract people from what Israel is currently doing, carrying out an ongoing genocide, and they want to distract people from the influence of the Israeli lobbies, controlling those Western governments. It's like, oh, look over there, look at China, and it's. I have to say, it's working. That's why they keep on doing it, but. At some point, people got to wise up to this. For me, it was immediately obvious why they're doing this. But you're gonna see a lot more of these kind of internet crazy posts as times goes on, as China continued to rise and the West continued to decline. The only manufacturing. Only manufacturer of the that U.S. is going to lead China is in the manufacturing of the copium. but it is what it is. This is there's not going to be, despite all the rhetorics and the tensions, I don't expect a war in the Western Pacific, because, if a war were to happen, it will devastate all the economies, all the economies of East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, etc. This is not in the interest of the people over here. Well, it might be in the interest of the United States, but for majority of the people that in East Asia, people still prefer to go on their business, and I don't see a much chance of a war breaking out. A war will only break out if U.S. really decide to press that button. But I don't think, like KJ pointed out, U.S. has realized at this particular juncture it's not able to do so because of serious resource constraints. So for the short term and intermediate terms, I'm still fairly optimistic about the prospect for peace in this region.
Gentlemen, KJ, Carl, anything else that you'd want to say before we begin to close out here? Is there anything that wasn't said?
Well,
Mhm.
yeah, I certainly hope Carl is right. I tend to be always, and this is my orientation, I tend to be more pessimistic. I believe that war is being planned. I believe that this is simply the U.S. reloading and pausing to reload. I agree, the rare earth elements are a critical constraint. But what we have to do is we have to remember the national security strategy is the first of a raft of documents. So we have to watch out for what the national defense strategy says. That'll come out early 2026. And then we have to look at the nuclear posture review and the national military strategy. Keep an eye out for those documents, because they will tell you what is coming next, especially the nuclear posture review. Because as I have said over and over again, if the U.S. decides to go to war over Taiwan or with China, it is most certain to go nuclear. And we see the groundwork has been laid out for 10 years by Elbridge Colby and the neocons. And I think that we still have to be very, very careful. If it goes to war, it is going to be a nuclear war. And this is why everybody has to put their shoulder to the wheel and prevent anything, any escalation to war. And we have to also understand that this is no longer a first world problem. Activists, especially progressives on the left, are used to dealing with first world problems, labor issues, salary issues, things like that. These are much, much higher stakes. It requires a much higher level of commitment and action than I think people are actually aware of and ready to commit to. But they have to be aware of that. The stakes are extraordinarily high.
I agree with KJ that if a war to break out between U.S. and China, it will go nuclear. But this is because the U.S. has been eclipsed in conventional war capability in the Western Pacific by China. That's why there's a lot of think tanks are now coming up with crazy papers calling for deployment of tactical nuclear weapons and how U.S. can win the nuclear war against China, which is completely nuts. But China is not standing still. China continued to build up its own both conventional capability and nuclear strike capability. Pentagon estimate that China will likely reach about 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. So if it's a nuclear war, then all bets are off. We're all gonna die. So I don't think we should be worried about it. I don't think my bet is not on the nuclear war. My bet is still on people's sense of self-preservation, because I still believe most of the people in Washington, the Washington elite, they're a bunch of grifters. They're stirring up the tensions to continue to justify, to redirect resources to line their own pockets, and so they can retire comfortably in the Bahamas. I don't think they are really looking forward to a to LARP fallout on U.S. mainland, because a lot of the assumptions in the past is that U.S. can inflict a lot of damage in Western Pacific, and the devastation that's going to be caused will cause in East Asia. You know, you'll be cities of China, cities of Japan and Korea that will be devastated. But no, if wars goes nuclear, U.S. will be nuked too, and China is building their nuclear capability to make sure that they will have the capability to nuke U.S. from sea to shining sea. So this is why I'm still maintaining my optimistic stance that things are going to be okay.
I think, Carl, I hope you're right, but I'm afraid that they are not afraid of nuclear war. I don't believe that they're afraid of dying. I believe that they are already dead inside. And that's the thing that really scares me.
Yeah, well, it certainly we will have to keep a lookout for those oncoming documents, as well as keep track of the U.S. empire's, what it actually does versus what the Trump administration says. And of course, you two will be back on soon, likely, because all of this continues to move very, very fast. With that said, everybody, hit the like button before you go. I want to thank all the new members and all the super chats. Thank you so much for your generosity to this program. Make sure that I have Carl Zha's YouTube in the video description. You can find KJ all over the internet. He's been on programs like mine, but so many others, and you can find his articles everywhere online. Anything I'm forgetting before we go, Jen, both of you? Anything that you want to plug if there's something new going on? Carl, I know you do Silk and Steel podcast. I know that's on your YouTube, but you can also find it other places. Without further ado, then.
Check out my YouTube. Check out my Patreon, Silk and Steel podcast. Support my surfing habits on Bali. Thanks, everybody.
And I want to say, everybody, get out into the streets. This is a serious moment. We need to be making our voices heard for peace.
Yes, indeed, everyone. You heard them. All right, everyone, hit the like button before you go. That will push their voices further in YouTube's algorithm. All the places to support this channel, Patreon, Substack, and more are also in the video description. And until next time, everyone, I'll see you Tuesday, I think, with Alistair Crook. So I'll see you then, 11 a.m. Eastern. Bye-bye.